I'm a little disappointed today.
You are?
Expected you to come back with a sash over your
Oh.
chest, with a crown on your head, and a scepter in your hand. Damian Farrell, he has now been honored at the AIA National Convention in Atlanta last month. Only 2 architects from Michigan chosen this year to receive an AIA fellowship. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Were one of them.
It was, my other fellows here in Michigan, many of, as you know, who supported me through this process, because it takes a great deal to get through the process, kept saying to me how much I would enjoy this and how meaningful it would be. And I had no idea. The Friday of all of the starting of the events was just extraordinary. We had a wonderful luncheon, all the new fellows. We were all introduced to each other. This was actually the largest class of new fellows ever into the American Institute of Architects, 147 of us from all around the country and actually around the world too. So there were 5 honorary fellowships given out to architects from other countries as well. And a wonderful lunch. We were bussed over to the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is the church that Martin Luther King and his father both preached in. And it's now a historic monument. And we were given half an hour of reflection time, which I think we all used, because the things that had been shared with us on the way to the church were terribly meaningful. Really was. It was what was laid out was the history of the fellowship, what it really meant, the expectations of responsibility and ongoing nurturing and teaching. And then to sit in this chapel, in this church, and it's more like a chapel. It's very small, and just sit and listen to this streaming tape of Martin Luther King and his father talking for half an hour really set the tone for us. Well, it did for me in a very meaningful way, and it connected me to a lot of South Africa and what South Africa has gone through, what it's going through. Then we walked right across the street to the new Ebenezer Church. And what was wonderful there is that this church was designed by an African-American husband and wife architect team.
Really?
From Atlanta, both of them in their late 80s. And he is struggling with his mobility, but I saw her on the convention floor and walking around taking classes. She was dressed beautifully dressed every day with a hat, with a scarf, with gloves, and carrying her purse, and everyone knew her and introduced. She was, clearly well loved. So this connection to Atlanta, and then the ceremony was just extraordinary. One at a time you brought up a quick something is said about you. The head of the AIA puts your medal around your head. And the biggest surprise, though, to most of us as I've talked to colleagues, we're given this book. It's a rectangular, very thick, beautifully bound book which details the history of the fellowship, but also every year's fellows, the list. And then you get back to your seat and you open this book and you start to look at some of the names that are in this book. Louis Kahn, Elwood Kahn, Bob Venturi, Michael Graves, Moshe Safdie, some of these names of the world's most famous architects over since the turn of the century.
Damian, as a fellow, what responsibilities do you have now?
To nurture the profession, nurture the younger people coming in, and push them towards something like fellowship as an idea.
The American Institute of Architects does a lot of that, and education is paramount with it, and fostering young people to go into architecture as a career.
Right.
I've been very impressed with the programs, not only on the national level, but on the local levels as well.
Yeah, the reach out. And the AIA is going through this national rebranding. It's a program I'm enjoying following. It's called I Look Up. And it's hashtag I Look Up. And it's really about educating the people to walk around and look up. And the current piece that is running on national television on the major channels is really interesting. It's a blind architect in combination with a young minority woman architect, and it very quickly kind of tracks their journey through architecture and how this blind architect is able to use software and touch, so what we would call Braille in the past, to conceptualize, and using things like Play-Doh and tactile instruments to design with, and communicate his design ideas, and people interpreting them even though he can't see. Wow. So I know it's the most extraordinary story. So it was a wonderful, humbling experience, and I think it for me it's created a new phase. I feel different. I feel like my charge now, and so do a lot of other people, is to make sure that the profession goes on. Mm-hmm. That I have a new charge to encourage young architects to really focus on the as we call it in our profession, the missing 35%, which is what minorities and women, getting them there, keeping them there, as we talked about with Dawn and Kristen in one of our previous shows.
And why it's so difficult for women to stay in the profession right now.
And all of that is really being addressed. I mean, it is being taken head on. So I came away, there was a lot of fun, a lot of levity. We had a wonderful Michigan party right after the investiture ceremony. I had my 5-month-old grandson there along with all my family. John Castellana, who is a Michigan architect who was chair of the jury. So to have one of your friends call your name among 147 people, to be escorted up by Gene Hopkins, Ann Arbor architect, the only Ann Arbor guy to ever head up the national AIA, to be escorted by Gene to the podium. And as we arrived at the podium, he turned and he looked at me and he said, in front of this church full of thousands of people, "You are not getting away without a hug." Oh. And I broke down. Oh. When I arrived in front of Elizabeth to get my medal, I had tears streaming down. I'm getting all choked up now, even thinking about it.
What a wonderful moment.
But this book is so powerful, this history. And so I come back with a fresh charge. I really do.
And you've been doing that all along on the show as well, imparting your wisdom and encouraging others and opening our eyes to what is out there in the world of design. He is Damian Farrell from Damian Farrell Design Group, and Damian on Design each week on the Lucy Ann Lance Show here on Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY. He is now an AIA Fellow. And just a couple of years ago, fewer than 3,200 of the more than 80,000 AIA members were fellows. Yeah. This certainly is a marvelous distinction.
And we had 22,000 of those show up in Atlanta for the convention. I think that says something, and we are in this crisis mode in the sense that for 7 retiring, we're only licensing a new one. Mm-hmm. But boy, is the profession looking to that, and looking to the impact that we have, and looking how to reach out just so far beyond what we just do as buildings and places. Mm-hmm. The broadness is just terrific.
Building of young minds, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Today on our show, as we salute Damian becoming a fellow, we're going to talk about multifamily housing. What is the criteria for a multifamily unit?
Anything more than 2.
Really?
Yes. Oh. So one and two, one unit or single family, and a duplex essentially, fall into their own little category. And then beyond that, 3 units and anything above is multifamily housing.
How do we handle multifamily housing throughout the various cities compared here to Ann Arbor? And what do you see across the country?
Managed mainly through zoning, as always. But
so it depends on the zoning laws
the zoning,
in the local communities.
Right, so density. So you've got R1 single family, R2 duplex, and then you go through, most communities have a series of R3s, so R3A, R3B, R3C, and then maybe an R4, and those depend on density. So like an R4 might push you to 50 units an acre, so you might have larger sites on the outskirts of town. Say, for example, here in Ann Arbor, or their property Nixon Road.
Right.
But if you looked closer to downtown, you might have R2 or R3. So where it limits the number of units congregated together on one floor, or it limits the number of units per acre.
Is this why, if your explanation, if I'm understanding this correctly, the lower numbers you'd see in more centralized areas than downtown? Or?
No. So, well, actually, good question. Really what it is, the higher density in the downtown core, then a softening of densities towards the outer residential areas.
Because you've got your
The medium density, and then what you find is on the larger greenfield sites, then the density starts to creep up again.
Because you can create bigger units,
yes,
apartment complexes,
exactly,
whatever.
and that's when transit really comes into it. So where those things are starting to happen, where those higher density projects are starting to happen on the outskirts, so either on brownfield sites, Detroit is a classic example, right? Or on greenfield sites, let's take Nixon Road again, then what the emphasis is starting to be put on things like public transportation, that you incorporate the ability that your development is a transit center. So if there's enough density in what you're doing, you might be able to bring in the small retail, all right, or the home office type function, but that you can use public transportation to get to places.
How do you put all that together as an architect?
Very much in conjunction with city planning staff and with planners. So looking at the big picture, overall master planning, absolutely essential to create those master plans. You know, when we had people like Wendy Ramson on board on the show, the city planner from New York City, Sky Duncan, talking about some of these master plan issues. And so as this pressure and this desire for urbanization, people want to move closer to the action. They want the walkability, they want the access to the public transportation, and they want the experience. That's a trend now which I think is safe. I mean, it's here. It's safely here is what I meant to say. And it's not going to go away. So now what's happening is people are having to look at the planning documents, as Ann Arbor did, in order to increase the density downtown, and then create this softening into the neighborhoods that surround downtowns, and then up the density again as you reach out and you start to create transportation-based zones. So new development happens in conjunction with transportation design. So whether it's road, rail, bus, all of those things. Whereas before, development, 20 years ago, it just happened. There was a big piece of land, and so you'd throw however many houses you were allowed on there, not necessarily tying it to the fact as to whether you actually had bus stops out there, whether taxi services actually ran out there, or in some of the major metropolitan areas, Atlanta and so on, whether you had access to rail service. Now those things are paramount in the way that those developments are happening. They don't happen unless those things are there.
So if you wanted to build out, say, on Nixon Road, how do you get that out there? Do you go to AATA
Yes,
or
you
transportation?
Do.
You say,
Absolutely.
I am going to be building out here, I'm thinking of it. What can you bring to
Yes,
this
here's
project?
my density in the designing of the streets. How am I taking care of bike lanes? What in doing in doing my development, what am I doing to allow things like zip cars, to allow things like recharge stations, allowing people to, including their bicycles, transportation. So it's not just assuming that the car is always going to be your only mode of transportation.
Perhaps not, but for those of us who still love our automobile here in the state that built the automobile and continues to do so, why it doesn't seem like there are always that you have to have places for the cars, enough spots. How do you determine that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And
I mean, we have to have bike lanes. We have to have the bus stops. We have to have all these things for these alternate transportation, but we don't always plan for the car.
Yeah.
Are we trying to shove people out of their automobiles?
No, I truly don't think so. I truly don't think so. I think our car parking standards have remained, and I think that they are reasonable when you're doing a new development. So, for instance, if you were doing, let's pick, because I happen to be working with one, let's pick an R3 zoning in Saline that I'm actually working on right now. You have to provide 2 parking spaces per unit.
Oh, you do?
All right. And then there is a ratio of visitor spots in relation to the number of units. So for every 8 units, you have to provide at least 1 visitor spot. All right. In my experience, we end up providing a few more than the minimums, just out of an experience.
Right.
As you get downtown, so like in the D1 in Ann Arbor, you are not required to provide parking. And so where the responsibility there falls is onto the DDA to continue to provide city parking. And I think that is working fairly well. But Where it's tough is the borderline neighborhoods. Old West Side is a good example. Those people on 2nd Street, 3rd Street, they feel it really hard because people are parking there and then walking to downtown. And so, but they have introduced permit systems where if you're a resident, you get a resident permit. And there are certain sides of the street you can park on and so on. But those are the areas that take most of the pressure, as the city. So it's just going to be this constant push-pull. So if you want to live on the Old West Side, Germantown, 4th Ward, those kinds of things, you're going to be experiencing some of this stuff.
Talking about where we're putting multifamily housing and the codes and the requirements. Interesting look at it today. Next week on the show with Damian Farrell, we're going to take a look at what's in those. What attracts people to them? What are you putting in them today that maybe you weren't doing a decade ago?
Oh, and it's so different.
The trends on multifamily housing will be next week's show.
Yeah.
Our thanks to Damian Farrell with Damian on Design each week here on the show. He's with Damian Farrell Design Group. You can go to dfdgonline.com to access information about his architectural practice. Great talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, as always.
And more coming up on the Lucy Ann Lance Show, Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY.